Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you this
Hey,
morning.
good morning. It's hot everywhere, right? That's all we have to announce today.
It's hot everywhere. News reports that like 110 and higher in Texas and some of the
Yeah.
west. Yeah, it's crazy hot, and it's hot and humid, and it's just good to be inside.
Right. That's right. Air conditioning. There was an article in the New York Times about what's going to give up first in all the heat. Is it going to be, something's got to give eventually, and they're trying to predict what it might be. But yeah, I guess it's hot everywhere, not just in the Southwest where it's usually hot, but through the Washington, D.C. and New York City, it's hot everywhere. That's about it. Other than that, we're going to talk about narcissism today.
We are, as we discussed in the last podcast, we were talking about oppositional defiant disorder. We said that we were going to transition and talk a little bit about narcissism. And as we were putting it together, we decided that we were going to break this up into two podcasts, because we're going to talk about narcissism in general, but then maybe next week talk about it more specifically in kids. But narcissism, like so many other things, antisocial and even autism and some of these things, they're words that are often used sort of in a very comfortable, sometimes accusatory, sometimes self-diagnostic way. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what narcissism is, and sort of hopefully demystify it just a little bit, because my goodness, anytime anybody talks about themselves a little bit, all of a sudden everybody says, oh, that person is narcissistic. And so we need to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, narcissism is in the news a lot these days. I don't know, we get different websites, and you hear about living with a narcissist, or dating a narcissist, or co-parenting with a narcissist. So there are all these articles being published. But as with most things, whether it's OCD or ADHD, people say, oh, you have OCD. People throw these terms around. But as with most such terms, narcissism is complex and complicated. And it's helpful, before we talk about narcissism in children, is to talk about narcissism in general. And we thought we'd do that today. And the next week, we'll talk about narcissism in children, because narcissism in children is related to oppositional defiant disorder in children. So we thought, well, it's an extension of that topic that we discussed 3 weeks prior. Frequently, kids with oppositional and defiant behavior tend to be a little bit narcissistic. Many of them tend to be narcissistic. So we thought we'd sort that out in the next couple of weeks.
Absolutely. So the word narcissism actually has some mythological.
Right.
There was the individual Narcissus, who, long story short, kind of falls in love with himself, rejects all these other suitors and romantic advances from other people, and basically falls in love with himself, and withers away and dies just sitting looking at himself in a pool of water. And when he died, a flower grew in that space, and that flower bared his name. And so that's where the idea of this exaggerated self-love comes from.
Which makes us realize that this has been around for a long time. I mean, the ancient Greeks, 2,000 years ago, were also concerned about this idea of exaggerated or excessive self-love, enough that they created a character.
Absolutely. So one of the things we have to differentiate, though, is the difference between narcissism as it relates to a personality trait versus what is considered a mental health disorder, because it's two very different things. I think that one of the things that I talk about with patients or other people when they bring up the idea of narcissism is that, we all, when we think about, some self-love, when we think about, sort of self-promotion and putting yourself out there, everybody could use a little bit of this. Everybody could use some self-love to encourage, good self-care and things like that. But that's a far cry. That's a very different thing from a mental health disorder.
That's right. And that, one of the popular movies last year was Maverick, the Top Gun extension. And, to get into a piece of machinery that goes 500 miles an hour and you're shooting at each other, that takes a little bit of self-confidence. If you're a surgeon and you crack somebody's chest open and grab his heart and start massaging it with your hands, that takes a lot of confidence.
Right.
And that's what we're talking about here, that there is this notion that I'm pretty good at doing, I'm capable of doing this.
That you can put your life in my hands. I will take the responsibility of your life. And I think that, I think physicians or health providers of all kinds,
right.
Even business leaders,
right.
if I'm going to start a business and I want your patronage, I want you to come to my business,
right.
I have to have some level of confidence to say that I can offer something that nobody else can offer.
That's right. Right.
So there has to be a little bit of that narcissistic tendency, that self-promotion tendency there to be successful in most things.
Right. And so when we talk about narcissism as a personality trait, we're talking about self-involvement. We're talking about a sense of entitlement. It's moving towards something that might be negative. But at one end of the spectrum, and we're going to talk about narcissism on a spectrum, we're talking about what might be a normal personality trait at some times in human development. Right? That's what we want to talk about. So we usually think of narcissism as a negative trait, but we also must view it as something that is normal. And we use the word normal carefully because it still is excessive. Okay, when we talk about narcissism, we're moving in a different direction. So yes, it's on a spectrum, and a little bit of what we sometimes call narcissism is okay. We have to remember that if it moves too far along that spectrum, we're going to get into dangerous territory.
Right. Yeah. So could you imagine the level of confidence and again, maybe healthy narcissism that one would have to say, here I am, elect me as president of the United States.
Right.
Put me in charge of the safety and security of millions of people, and let me be the one to be in charge and to guide all of these decisions that have to be made and all of these things that have to be done. That requires some narcissism. And, you think about someone like Teddy Roosevelt or some people, right. Many of the people who have been in that position who are able to balance this high level of self-esteem with pro-social behaviors. They can right. make good decisions. They can relate to other people in a healthy and appropriate way. Now, right. we can't say that all people who have that high level of self-esteem engage in pro-social behaviors, and that's where we start to see that imbalance in the system there. But right. when you have that good balance of high self-esteem with pro-social behaviors, then we're talking about some healthy narcissistic types of tendencies.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. I think it's a really good example of healthy narcissism. I mean, if you're talking about a spectrum, I think Teddy Roosevelt embodies that. His daughter said one time that my father had to be the corpse at every funeral, the baby at every christening, and the bride at every wedding. So the entire family acknowledged that he was a narcissist, but he was a narcissist who did good. Right. He's also the person who developed our public parks, our national park system. Teddy Roosevelt did a lot of good for a lot of people.
Right.
That's healthy narcissism. But there is also a pathological narcissism that we also need to be concerned about. So healthy narcissism is that balance right. between high self-esteem and pro-social behaviors. Pathological narcissism is kind of what we want to talk about today, is that we want to move from from this healthy narcissism that some people possess to this pathological narcissism. And that's where the word excessive comes in. Excessive self-love that damages relationships. And again, we want to be careful here, because when we talk about a mental health disorder, we have to talk about some kind of impairment.
Right.
So excessive self-love damages relationships and serves only the narcissist.
Right.
Teddy Roosevelt served other people. A true narcissist serves only him or herself.
Right. And so we see this in situations where, again, you have that self-love and that the damaging of relationships to the point that it really works to preserve or protect the individual's ego. And so many times it's a very sort of paradoxical notion to consider, but many times a person who has narcissism actually has a very low self-esteem. Now, their sense of self-worth is and self-love is really high, but their self-esteem may be really fragile. And so they have to engage, or they sort of perceive themselves of having to engage in these narcissistic tendencies that, again, damage relationships, all with the goal of preserving and protecting and shielding that fragile ego. And we see this in people who, they become very angry and they may become very hostile anytime they're challenged. And especially if they're challenged with sufficient evidence to suggest that they are incorrect or that they made an error. And they really have a difficult time managing it. They can't handle that shot to their ego, because it's just too fragile to manage it.
Yeah, I think it may be safe to say that many people who have narcissistic tendencies might have a fragile ego. It's easily damaged. In fact, some writers say that narcissism is an effort, pathological narcissism protects the ego, but in maladaptive ways, in dangerous and destructive ways. So when we talk about pathological narcissism, it's characterized by authoritarianism. I know best, you will do what I say. Okay. Envy of others, grandiosity, I'm the best, I know more. The famous, we always talk about Hitler when we talk about this stuff. Hitler once said, I know more than my generals. And there's a famous scene from a video clip where he's there at a map and he's got 3 generals around him, and he sort of pushes the hand of one of the generals away and inserts himself into it. Again, that very dramatic display of I know more than you do, though he was never a general. So there's that sense of grandiosity. And the other thing the other recurring theme that we want to talk about over and over again, and it's especially relevant with children, is a deficit in empathy and remorse. They don't care that they've hurt somebody. And it's not sympathy we're talking about, it's empathy. They're unable of seeing something from anybody else's point of view. It's always their point of view that is apparent. They just don't think in terms of the other person. So not sympathy, but empathy and remorse are the other characteristics.
Right. And you said earlier that that there are periods of development where this is typical, and we want this to happen, with really young children.
With infants, sure.
Yeah, they have to be somewhat narcissistic in that, but it's part of that developmental progression that, they're learning some of these things. But everything, to those kids, everything is about them.
That's right. If you take a typical infant, in fact, Freud talked about it, primary narcissism, where they're only concerned about their own survival.
Right.
And rightfully so.
Right. And so as they develop and build, and that tends to go away at about the time that they develop empathy, and they can start to experience and express remorse and taking accountability for their behavior. So like so many other mental health conditions, it becomes a mental illness, if we want to use that phrase. It becomes a mental illness at a point where it is developmentally inappropriate. It's causing an impairment in functioning of some kind. And so as in the example you gave with Hitler, what we see is many times people with these tendencies, they will talk about how they know more than the experts in these different areas, that they know more than anyone else, that they have had the most experiences with things, that they have done the most things and are the best at this and at that. But yet anytime they're pushed or challenged, they those people that they may have aligned themselves with, they completely reject and they get rid of them because, oh, well, it was their fault. They did it. It was, it wasn't my mistake. It was their mistake. It was somebody else that did it. And so you see this pattern happening with people with these pathological narcissistic traits.
Right. Yeah. And I think that when you talk about an infant is self-absorbed. They refer to it as they live in an objectless environment. There are no other objects in the environment. They are the center of the universe. They don't think in terms of others, but it's an infant. Birth to 12 is infancy. They don't think about others. At about age 2 or 3, those children, those young toddlers, begin to develop empathy. They will comfort another child at 2 or 3 years old. They'll comfort a parent. If they see a parent crying, they'll comfort the parent. So at about age 2 or 3, we see the development of empathy, but we also see the beginnings of narcissism, because there are 2 or 3-year-olds. Toddlers are narcissistic. They tend to be very self-centered. It's mine. You try to take something from them and they clutch it. They'll fight you for it. So toddlers are by nature narcissistic, but they are also developing empathy. And we have to remember that either can develop through childhood.
Right.
So from birth to 5, both of those things are vying for development. And a child can develop empathy or they can develop narcissism depending on the environment that they're living in.
Right. And so even in children who develop that empathy and seem to do well as they progress through elementary school and middle school, as they approach adolescence, we see a reemergence of some of this.
Absolutely.
Because again, thinking about teenagers, nobody has ever experienced what the teenager experiences. You don't know what it's like to be me. Nobody else in the world has it as difficult as me. And so it again has this tendency to turn back onto themselves. And, parents often talk about, he doesn't seem to care. He doesn't seem to, a parent could sit there and tell their teenager over and over again about what effect his or her behavior is having on the family. And the teenager just says, yeah, but when can I have my phone back? It's like that's all that they focus on is themselves and what they want and need.
That's right. And that's called teenage narcissism. Okay, so we have infant narcissism, toddler narcissism, teenage narcissism. It's absolutely, parents will come in and say, all she thinks about is herself. That's right. She must be a teenager, because that's what teenagers do. I love when you say things like, nobody can feel this the way, nobody feels things the way I feel things. Well, my goodness, we all felt that when we were teenagers. Okay. But that's okay. We all have to go through those years alone. So yes, when we become teenagers, we once again become very, very, very selfish, self-centered, self-absorbed, hours in front of the mirror, playing with our hair, redoing our makeup, worrying about our clothes. Everything is a big deal when you're a teenager because you're so important. Okay. Yeah. It's a personal fable. I'm unique in the world. Okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's normal. Okay. Now, the other thing is when we talk about true narcissism, problematic narcissism, pathological narcissism, that begins to emerge around age 7 or 8.
Yeah, we can see it as early as those ages. Sometimes it's a little bit later, but given what we were just talking about, that infancy, toddlerhood, and adolescence, so we have this span of time in childhood, thinking about the elementary school years, where that it should not be there. That's when the child should have enough empathy, should have enough remorse and understanding of things to where we don't see the narcissistic traits there. So if we start to see narcissistic tendencies at that time, that's when we need to be concerned.
That's right. In most elementary schools, you're not going to see a lot of narcissism.
Right.
You're going to see a lot of it in middle schools.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to see a lot of it you're going to see it in daycare centers. You're going to see it in middle school. You're not going to see a lot of narcissism in elementary schools. But if you see it in your own child or you see it in your students, that's when you start to get concerned, because after age 7 or 8, children have the cognitive capacity to make global self-evaluations by comparing themselves to others. When you're 4 or 5, you say, "Oh, I'm the best baseball player on my team. I'm the best soccer player on my team." But about 2nd or 3rd grade, you say, "Oh, I'm not as good as those guys." And a lot of kids drop out of sports because they realize other kids are better than they are.
Mm-hmm.
That cognitive ability emerges at around age 7 or 8. So we're talking about 2nd or 3rd grade, because you can now compare yourselves to others. So what you want to watch for are these typical characteristics that we associate with narcissism.
Right.
But
recognize that we don't make a diagnosis of narcissism. And diagnosis that we're talking about is narcissistic personality disorder. We don't personality disorder diagnoses until a person is at least 18.
That's right. And it's because there are normal stages of narcissism prior to age 18. You just don't know whether it's teenage narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. So we wait until they're through adolescence.
Right. Absolutely. And so, and part of that also is because if you recognize it in the 7, 8, 9-year-old, there is still time to treat that. It is far easier to address some of these behaviors and tendencies in a 7 or 8-year-old than it is in a 27-year-old, because it has been there. When they've been there so long, it's hard to adjust and redirect that. But in these earlier ages, even if you recognize it, there's still chance that you can, thwart those tendencies towards developing some of those personality traits.
Right. Yeah. So after age 7 or 8, the things you should be looking for are a child who always has to be the center of attention. Mm-hmm. Normal at age 4 or 5, but by age 7 and 8, that's one. Always needs to be the center of attention. Second, always needs to win. Little kids, you play Candyland with a 3 or 4-year-old, they like to win. If they need to win, if they're 7, 8, 9 years old, and they have a violent temper tantrum if they lose a game, that's a cause for concern. Or a tendency to bully others. Mm-hmm. Again, that's a weak ego. These all suggest, these 3 things, center of attention, need to win, bullying others, these suggest that there might be a tendency toward unhealthy narcissism. So what we see is extreme entitlement, exploiting others, and being overly aggressive. Those are the sorts of signs we need to be careful about after age 7 or 8. And as you say, you can ameliorate those things with interventions when children are younger, when they're 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. You can imagine the damage that's done if a child always has to win and the entire family gives in every time they're playing, every time it's game night. Mm-hmm. Only one person is allowed to win. That's nurturing narcissism, and we need to be very careful that we don't do that.
Absolutely. And now, again, feel like I always have to throw in the just because a child has some of these tendencies doesn't mean that they're developing narcissistic traits. That's because right. There are a lot of kids who have some of these traits, but for very different reasons. And so if your kid has some of these things, don't necessarily immediately jump to, oh my gosh, he's developing narcissism and that must be it. There's lots of other reasons for it. But this is one important possibility. And it's, we tend to, the way that we see most often is in retrospect. So you see someone as an adult and, they have some of those narcissistic personality traits, and you say, well, what was it like as a child? he always had to be the center of attention. He insisted on winning all the time. That's when you see that looking at it prospectively is more difficult, because some of these tendencies could be characteristic of a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And we talked about the relationship between narcissism and oppositional defiant disorder.
Right.
Oppositional defiant disorder and narcissism are related in that both are seeking to get their needs met.
Right.
The difference is that the oppositional and defiant child is just struggling for power and control, where the child with narcissistic tendencies is seeking to get, they're pursuing self-love, they're pursuing their own interests at the expense of everything else. And there's no remorse that I deserve this, I am special, and I deserve this. Whereas a child with oppositional defiant disorder will say, I wanted this, and I realized that I went a little too far. And so there's some apology, there's some remorse, there's some guilt. With children with narcissistic tendencies, that doesn't exist. There is no remorse. They just don't see things from another person's point of view. Whereas a child with oppositional defiant disorder will. They say, yeah, I know, I hurt his feelings, but I wanted this. And so, yeah, I know that I did that. Whereas a child with narcissistic tendencies says, doesn't matter, I don't care. I don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So
go ahead.
So with children, children tend to be self-focused till about 7 or 8, until they begin to develop social skills. All the important things so empathy, sympathy, understanding, care about others, care about the classroom, care about your home. Those are the development of social skills. And that's what children who have narcissistic tendencies aren't developing. It's an inability to develop emotional and relational awareness with others. They're so focused on themselves, they simply don't care about others. The way I put it is that other people aren't on their radar screen. There's only one person there. It's the child. Right.
And if you think about it, there are lots of things that, and we'll talk more about this perhaps next time, but there are lots of things that we do as parents that contribute to some of this.
Right.
If you treat your child, inform your child, train your child to believe and understand that they are always right, that they can do no wrong, that they never have to be held accountable for any poor decisions that they make. If any error that they make, it wasn't their fault, it was somebody else's fault, or you just didn't understand it. You just weren't given the things that you needed to be able to pass that or to accomplish that. Those are things that parents do, we think, well, we're trying to preserve their self-esteem and we're trying to strengthen them and encourage them. But if we're not careful, too much of that can lead to the child forming a true belief that they can do no wrong.
That's right. I think one of the biggest mistakes that many parents make is this overvaluation of the child, and you're right, I like the way you put that, is that you can do no, it's not your fault. If there's a problem, it's not your fault. It's the umpire, it's the referee, right. It's your teammates. If your teammates would do this, you could score more goals. Yeah. It's the teacher's fault. She didn't explain it adequately, or she didn't give you enough time, or she should have been more understanding. Right. It's never your fault. And that's when you move toward this excessive self-love, because children internalize those messages and say, well, if my parents are telling me this, must be true.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So sometimes it is your fault. It's not the coach. You right. Can't blame everybody else. You have to take responsibility, and you have to learn how to deal with those failures.
Right. Absolutely. So next time we are going to focus a little bit more specifically on narcissism and those traits, sort of pathological traits in kids and teenagers, because as you said earlier, it is related to some of those oppositional and defiant types of behaviors that we talked about over the last few weeks. And so we're going to spend some time talking about it more specifically next week as it relates to kids.
Right. Yeah. And what we have to remember with children is that selfishness and empathy develop at the same time. Right. And our job as parents is to nurture one and discourage the other. And it's, again, one of those balancing acts. that parents just have to assume and manage correctly.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's it for this week. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.